Today we're going to finish up our discussion of Chapter 10 and talk about Sections 4 and 5. This focuses on some of the evidence that we have for evolution and our modern understanding of how to study evolution. The first piece of evidence that we will discuss is something that Darwin himself would have looked at, and that is fossil evidence. This is some of the most direct evidence that we have to show us how species have changed over time. Especially in areas where there's an exposed cliff face that has fossils in it, we can definitely see how fossils in the lower layers, which would be the older layers of rock, are different from the fossils that are in the upper layers. So we can really see two things from this. First of all, we can see that species that exist today do seem to have changed because we can see those changes over time. And then the other thing that we can see is that the species that are alive today are not the same as species that existed in the past. We can tell things like mass extinction events. We can tell when all of a sudden a new species appears in the fossil record. So fossils are a really good way to study those ancient organisms. Our next piece of evidence is called biogeography. Bio obviously means life, and geography would be where things are located. So if we look at the location of different species, we can see that even if they live in different geographic regions, they will tend to evolve similar adaptations because adaptations allow species to survive in some kind of a particular environment. And if that environment exists in different places, we can and do see evolution repeat itself and happen in the same way in multiple different locations. This is an idea called convergent evolution. If you have two or more species that are relatively unrelated, they don't share a very close recent ancestor, if they have similar adaptations because they live in a similar environment, those adaptations are not the result of shared ancestry and are more of a result of evolution happening in the same way in two different places. So one example of that would be the different species of camelids, which you see here. Things like camels, llamas, alpacas, vicuñas. Those are all organisms that have a very similar body shape. They tend to have fat-filled deposits on their back that they can break down over time to supply moisture and energy. They tend to live in sandy, dry environments, so they would have long eyelashes to keep the sand out of their eyes, have a very long intestine so that it really helps in the reabsorption of water. They have padded feet to help them walk on the sand. All of these adaptations we see in these different types of camelid species, but they don't get them from a common ancestor. They have evolved those adaptations independently over time in different regions of the world. Our next evidence for evolution comes from embryology. That is the study of embryos. And what we see here are actual invertebrates, a crab and a barnacle here. Look at the adult form. They look very different from each other, but they come from the same body plan. They both have larvae that look pretty much exactly like this. And so the differences that come about between the adults are really actually differences in gene expression as the larvae are developing. And so the fact that they both start out with very similar looking larval stages is evidence that they shared a common ancestor that had that shape. Vertebrate embryos, it's the same sort of thing. We can see a bunch of different vertebrate embryos. If you look at the top row here, they all look pretty much the same. It's not until we get to the actual more differentiated or more developed form of each species that we can really start to see a difference between a fish versus a chick versus a human. And so again, this high degree of similarity would suggest that all of these organisms have descended from an ancestor that had this basic body plan, And then the difference between a human and a rabbit and a cat has more to do with how they develop a little bit later on in life. We can also look at the anatomy of not just embryos, but adult versions of the organisms. And one of our types of anatomical structures that's really important evidence for a common ancestor is what we call a homologous structure. Homologous structures are structures of an organism that are very similar in the way they're put together. The actual bone structure itself is very similar, even if the function is different. So what that would suggest is that there was a common ancestor. That ancestor had this particular arrangement of bones, and then the descendants from that ancestor, some of them have descended to become bats, and so their adaptations are more for flying. Other descendants became whales. Well, obviously whales have a very different environment that they live in, so their arm bones and finger bones are more well adapted to be a flipper. Versus a cat, that is a walking leg, versus an arm for a human that's used for picking things up and grasping things with the hand. So all of these are homologous structures because they have the same underlying bone structure, but evolution has caused those structures to look different from each other because they have different functions. Our next type of anatomical structure is called analogous structures. This is kind of the opposite. This would not suggest a common ancestor. Instead, analogous structures have similar functions, but the structure or how that thing is put together is very different. So if we look at these two examples here, we have the wings of the fly or other insects, really. We have those on the left compared with the wing of the bat on the right. Well, a fly wing is very different from a bat wing. The only similarity that they have is how they are used. And so this would be an example of two very different ancestors, and the lines of descent from those ancestors evolved into organisms that live in a similar environment. They both fly, but the underlying structure of the wing itself is very different. So it would not suggest that they are particularly closely related to each other. And then our third type of structure that we will discuss is called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are the remnants of an organ or a type of bone or something that perhaps functioned in the ancestor of the species, but no longer has a useful function in that modern organism. An example of this would be something like the wings of an ostrich. It's a bird, so it came from bird ancestors, which we know had wings. Well, the ostrich itself does not actually use its wings, at least not for flying. It can use them as a display, but that's not the original purpose of the wing, and so we would consider those wings to be vestigial structures. Same thing in a whale. If you were to look at a whale skeleton, you can actually find where you would expect the pelvis to be, the hips and the legs. Well, whales don't have legs, but they do have these pelvic bones in the exact same place and the same type of arrangement you would expect in a land-dwelling organism that did have hind legs. So what that suggests is that whales actually evolved from four-legged land-dwelling ancestors, and over time, as they became to spend more time in the water, those hind legs were less useful, and so they became reduced. Now, don't confuse this with Lamarck's idea of use versus disuse. The reason why this structure is much reduced is not because the whale didn't use it, at least not directly. The explanation for this would be if there were some whales born without hind legs or with very small hind legs, they had an advantage, a survival advantage, because they weren't using the hind leg anyway, so it doesn't make sense for the whale to put in a lot of resources to try to maintain a structure that's not useful. So a whale that was missing hind legs actually could have had an advantage because they weren't getting in the way and you weren't having to use precious resources trying to maintain that structure. And that would be why the legs would disappear, not just because, oh, it didn't use its legs are going to shrivel up and be gone. All right, our next evidence is going to be molecular to include genetic evidence. This is going to be some of the most compelling evidence that we have today to show how related things are. And so some of the molecules that are critical for life are going to be molecules that are found in every single living thing. Things like nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids. Every living thing has those 4 macromolecules. Well, what does that suggest? That suggests that an ancestor was built out of those types of molecules, and because those were the molecules available to make life, all of the descendants from that ancestor is also made out of those types of molecules. Same thing for ATP. This is a universal energy molecule among all types of life. Whether it's bacteria, plant, animal, whatever, they use ATP, which means that this is probably a shared characteristic that came from an ancient ancestor. So when we're looking at molecular evidence today, what we are looking at is mostly things like DNA sequences and comparing how similar the sequence is between one organism and another. We would expect that the DNA sequences of things that are closely related are going to be very similar to each other. Just like if you have a sibling, your DNA is much more similar to that of your sibling than it is to somebody who's unrelated to you. And we definitely think that the best way to find out the true evolutionary relationship between species is to analyze sequence data rather than anatomical data. Sometimes an anatomical structure can be misleading, but the DNA sequence tells us a more complete story about how things are related. Good example of this would be if we compare bats and dolphins. They both use echolocation to find their food, but the genes that are involved in the echolocation in the bat are very different from the genes that are involved in the echolocation of the dolphin. So that would suggest that echolocation as a trait has evolved independently in 2 different lines of descent from different ancestors. And we know that because we've studied the DNA sequence of the genes involved in echolocation for both of these types of organisms, and we see that they are mutated in different ways, and so they aren't really particularly related to each other. So hopefully you found this to be helpful, some of our evidence that we have for evolution and a discussion of how we study that evidence today. If you have any questions, please make sure you ask those in class.